Joyeeta, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you, Davor.
Very good seeing you here. We have to talk about water and law. And I thought I brought us some water. If you would like, we could drink a bit and then talk law.
Thank you. I should have brought my own water bottle to the table because that's much more environmentally friendly,
Much
but
more.
much more. But nevertheless,
Uh, we are two lawyers put together here. And I think, although it's dark, I think there are still some people in the public out in auditorium. My good guess would be that there are no other lawyers present here. But also I would assume if the auditorium is full of lawyers, none of them would be lawyers from the Anthropocene. What do you think about that?
I'm absolutely sure of that. Most people I know in the social science world or in the legal world are not yet familiar with the concept of the Anthropocene. And it's only a small community of scholars from the legal community that have actually engaged with the concept of the Anthropocene in the last few years.
What are we doing, the two of us? It means, as a lawyers, we are not making money. We are making books. And
Well, primarily, if you look at the legal profession, it has tended to generate scholars as well as professionals. But most people tend to focus on those aspects of the law that generate a large amount of money. So there are very few lawyers who actually work on ecological issues and water-related issues. And that's basically the lawyers who work in, perhaps in the academic field, but also in the, even in the professional field, there are quite a few lawyers coming up that work on environmental issues.
of course, we have many colleagues working on the environmental law issues. But even among them, you rarely found an interest of a lawyer for the Anthropocene. How it came for you, really? How did you become interested in the Anthropocene and how you see it really in your own field?
Well, I started working on climate change in 1988, 89. And when you start working on climate change law and policy, you immediately hear the word anthropogenic greenhouse gases. And 3 or 4 years later, we had the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development adopted by the United Nations. And then the big critique from the environmental world was it was anthropocentric, focused on human beings. So when in 2000 the word Anthropocene came onto the agenda in a discussion, and later on by 2002 and subsequently it became a little bit more popularized, it seemed like a logical progression from anthropogenic, anthropocentric to Anthropocene for me. But I understand why lawyers don't engage with this concept, because most lawyers focus on a shorter term of time. Most political scientists also focus on a short period of time, whereas the Anthropocene concept puts us into a geological time frame.
Yes. Both as to the past and as to the future, I would say.
Exactly.
You see, I thought before coming here how it occurred to me. Why did I, law of the sea specialist really, why did I start to be attached to the concept of the Anthropocene, how it came? So I thought back. I recall I was not that early with anthropogenic and so. But I recall in 2008, I organized a conference in Oslo, World Ocean in Globalization. And really, in order to make a good grip on this, you needed some scientists. You can't invite only lawyers. So we invited some scientists. And two of them came from New Zealand. And they said at one moment, this was August 2008, that we need to enter the Anthropocene by design and not by default. Well, I must admit the word did not catch my attention immediately. But later on, I had to edit the book. And then, well, when you edit the book, you have to know every term in the book. And then I got this term Anthropocene. What does it mean? What's that? So I did the most proper research, and that's Google. I Googled it. I did that. And what I found, and I remember the date, because the day after I sent one letter, and I read the letter a few days ago. So the date was 27 August 2009. So you know those books come sometimes very late after conferences. And then I got on Google altogether 74 hits for the Anthropocene. That's in all the time.
Oh, yep.
Well, just to add, I Googled it a few days ago. Now it's around 1 million. So something has happened over those 5 years. But what I read in those 74, I read them all because it was not, there were some double hits. And I understood that what it is about is that geologists have taken the matter after Cruzen's proposal in 2000. And they are now, and that was the London Commission on Stratigraphy, they have written an article and published in 2008, Are we now living in the Anthropocene? So what they were proposing to do is to make a geological investigation of whether this term has a geological substance, whether it really means that we are leaving the Holocene and entering a new epoch. That was the hypothesis. So I thought, well, there are many possible relationships between geology and law. The first one, which I came to, was a standard one, really. I did a graduation thesis on the continental shelf. And that is a typical example of how geology and law join,
Yeah.
really. How they inform each other, if you wish. And then this was this long development from 1945, when the concept of continental shelf was proposed by Truman and by US. Ultimately, it resulted in United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in the long run from 1945 to 1982. Today, we call this Constitution for the Ocean. There are 166 parties to it. It's customary law and so on and so forth. But really, the issue started from this continent, from this geological, I would say, foundation, that there are resources, oil, primarily hydrocarbons, which lie now outside of the reach of sovereignty, meaning beyond territorial sea, in the submarine areas, and which we cannot, in 1945, under present rules, get our hands on. And then the concept was proposed.
But then if you also move from the oceans to
Yes.
land, then you find that every single society on Earth that developed through history developed along river basins. So you can actually go back into history quite a bit to see the relationships between human beings and the water system. And you find that these river basins established customs. Those customs were either sort of customary law, if you like, but they also got institutionalized into their religions later. So you find that Islamic law made rules on water. You found Hindu law made rules on water. And then gradually over time, you find that these laws become more and more institutionalized, and they begin from a local level, and they over the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, they've come to the global level. And in fact, the water system is a geological, and part of the global ecosystem. That is what we were trying to use for our livelihoods, for our food production. So law has a long history in relation to water, at least with freshwater systems. And for me, there are a couple of links between the Anthropocene and law, but there are also certain distinctions. So if I look at what's common in terms of the way we look at it, well, an Anthropocene approach basically tells us that there's a long history. And maybe the Anthropocene geologists are looking into millions of years, but we as scholars probably are looking several hundred years, if not 1,000 years. The other thing is the Anthropocene makes us look at the Earth as a system. And I think that increasingly we lawyers are coming to the conclusion that if you want to regulate development you have to look at the environmental aspects, and you need an integrated systemic approach to understanding those issues. So that would be perhaps the second aspect of the Anthropocene and law. A third aspect is practically every driver of water pollution or water use or water navigation is something that can be either related at local level demand, but it can also be related to global institutions like trade. So you have all the levels involved, and that increasingly means that international law will become a bit of a strange animal in the future. We will have to have multi-level legal governance systems where international law can actually break the boundaries of just legal systems between states. And on the other hand, I think the Anthropocene concept is so global in nature that it ignores one of the fundamental aspects of politics and law, which is the human, the city, the rural area, life context. And so actually what we try to do, what you and I try to do in our daily lives, is to see how can we also help the people who are going to benefit from this either directly or indirectly. How can we help them understand how to govern these resources? So in that sense, we are slightly distinct from the Anthropocene school, which takes a much bigger systemic approach. And so we can draw inspiration from the concept of the Anthropocene, but there are also limits to that inspiration.
But what do you think, really, our international law,
Yeah.
when my rudimentary connection of Anthropocene with international law was really then connecting geology with international law, with this continental shelf. But then, well, days were passing and maybe weeks and months, but this idea was not leaving me. It's still here. And I'm thinking, international law, isn't this really a system of rules in its fundaments, crafted for the situation of the Holocene, which is our experience, as it will last forever? Because look, what is a fundamental in our discipline? It is the state still. The state as the main, most important subject. What defines it? A defined territory, population, and a government, let's say more or less independent, depends. We have roughly 200 states. But all this, and in the law of the sea, when we define what a state is, of course it's on the sea as well. There is sovereignty which extends
Into the sea.
into the sea, onto the sea, under the sea, above the sea, 12 nautical miles. And then we measure this from the baseline. It's one fixed line. And that line is drawn on a map with reliance on the geographical features of the coast perceived to be permanent, objective features.
But you can go a step further.
Yes.
You can argue that every country has used geographical barriers to become a boundary of a state. So many countries have used river boundaries to generate their boundaries or mountains. And so in fact our nation states, or even our other states that are not always just nations as such, all of them have had a very strong relationship with the geography of that area. But I think your earlier point where you said that maybe our governance systems are focused on the Holocene and are not ready for the Anthropocene. If I were to take that argument further, I would say that in the Holocene, assuming that that is something that we have had experience of, governance systems followed the problems that humans made. And maybe in the Anthropocene, we are so smart that we can anticipate all kinds of new problems, and that our governance systems must learn to anticipate these problems and learn to deal with it, which means that our whole basis of how we govern has to drastically shift.
And imagine that this smartness now comes from lawyers. Unbelievable.
Yeah, but
But I
unfortunately...
agree. I agree. We need a complete shift of paradigm, because we have international law, which is the law of Holocene.
Yes.
But we have the question now.
But
if the Earth is entering the Anthropocene, will international law stay in the Holocene? Will we still have same structures?
Or will it change?
Or will it change? And
And
how
I-
will it change?
And then the question is, it's not just international law. So that's what one of the
Yes.
arguments I want to make is that when we move, if we are moving now into the Anthropocene, then it can't just be international law, it has to be multi-level law.
course.
But it can't also be just law, it has to be governance in a much broader sense. On the other hand, for me, it's really important that we try to make sure that we live in a global community. And for me, a global community can only be formed when we have a fundamental constitution, not just for the law, not just for the seas, but for all society globally. And that we have the rule of law globally, so that no country, no person, no bank is above the law. And once we can establish some kind of constitutionalism, even if we have certain reactive policy processes, if somebody makes a mistake and causes damage to somebody else, then the old principle of no harm to others should kick in, and countries or individuals or companies should be held accountable for their behavior, because they cannot argue anymore that they did not know from a scientific perspective that what they did was wrong, because the science is already telling us that, for example, if you emit greenhouse gases, you might lead to sea level rise, and if that sea level rise occurs,
level rise,
it's
yes.
going to cause large-scale death and destruction in coastal regions as well as infrastructure. So they can't argue afterwards, we did not know. But we don't have a legal system as yet that can actually ensure such liability at the global level. And so that is where we have to work towards. How can we establish these parameters? And that's the role, I think, of us lawyers, because we have to hold politicians and other actors accountable.
Let me catch on this sea level rise. I think it's a very important issue. You see there at the back where they sit. They are approximately 1 meter higher. And the most conservative scientific forecasts now are going towards 1 meter. And there are for this century,
Yeah.
to the end of this century. I have a friend who is 101 years old, an international lawyer. So it's one human lifetime.
Yes.
1 century. So what will happen? Suppose it's a sea level rise of 1 meter. Scientists say this is a possible scenario. Some say 2 meters. There are some semi-empirical studies which have higher focus. We don't know, really. Nobody knows, probably. Because in geological past, geologists told me there were very rapid sea level rises. So it's very difficult to make those forecasts. It's difficult to say how much Greenland will contribute, how much West Antarctic. There are studies being done. We simply don't know yet, but however, there is a possibility, a reasonable and serious possibility. So if this happens, Tuvalu in the Pacific, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, those 3 small island states, and then in the Indian Ocean, Maldives,
Yes.
if I'm not wrong, they won't be here, they won't be there, but here.
Yes.
They don't need to be entirely under the sea level, but a livelihood there won't be possible. So the questions which I see as opened in that relatively soon coming scenario, is first, what will happen with all those big marine zones around those island countries? Will they still have them or not? Because you could argue, if a definition of state is as it is, well, you don't have an inhabitable territory anymore, and you don't have a population on it.
Yeah.
So do you lose your zones? And even more than that, where will those people go? That is the key question. Where will...
There's another key question, and that is what happens to their nationality. If they
Yes.
belong to a particular area, and if, God forbid, an island should disappear in the next few decades, then that whole notion of that island, the identity, the nationality, all that will disappear. And this is why I think that in the Anthropocene, law must argue that no state has the right, or all of us as a collectivity have no right to ensure or to lead to a situation where other people lose their nationality, where other people lose their land, where other people lose their marine resources. And so for me, in the Anthropocene, we can't just talk about the fact that our practices are legal, we have to also think in terms of how what we do will affect other people in other parts of the world. And you're bringing up 4 relatively small islands, but the bulk of the global population lives along coastal
The coast,
zones and
yes.
along river
Right.
basins. So it's going to affect all of these people. It will affect people in the mountain regions. It will affect people in the desert regions. And the question now is, can we just sit back and say, well, because our governments did not accept the Kyoto Protocol, therefore we don't have to take action? I think, and there's another argument over here that I keep hearing, and that is that the argument that in democracies the state can't force people because people decide who the new government will be.
Yes.
And so essentially the state is a captive of the people, and if the people don't want to sacrifice something in their lives, then the state can take no action. Now there are 2 problems with this for me. One problem in this is that the state is then abdicating its responsibility with respect to other states. And the people in these countries are abdicating their responsibilities with respect to people in other countries. And the second problem is it doesn't have to be a sacrifice. It's how we present it, because there are ways to keep the well-being of people without necessarily sacrificing on. So you can minimize your emissions of greenhouse gases without sacrificing on your well-being. And I think that is a sense of responsibility that has to come with the Anthropocene. It has to be a global responsibility to people in other parts of the world as well.
What do you think? How will they move? Will they move as individuals, or will they move as a nation?
They have
What
to
is-
move as both.
Yes.
You have to have states that are willing to take responsibility for actions. So, for example, right now we have the Ebola crisis, and you see many developed countries are now taking policies at the state level, not at the individual level. They're making policies at the state level as to how they're going to protect their hospitals, how they're going to protect the movement of people and goods and services worldwide. At this point, they're not saying this is going to be determined by all our citizens. So the state has to take responsibility. But this does not mean that people don't have to take responsibility as well. And what you find is that a lot of people feel that this is such an abstract problem and such a future problem,
Exactly.
and doesn't
Future.
concern them, that they don't think it's important. But the climate change problem is now. The Anthropocene is now. So that question of sort of delaying responses, I think that's an excuse. And if people don't take responsibility, maybe the state has to.
And you know, my 101-year-old friend,
Yes.
he is an international lawyer, and when I told him about this issue, he said, well, this is an urgent problem.
Yes.
Let's get hold of it. So, yes, sometimes wisdom comes with age, but we don't have much time to wait.
But what lawyers
don't
can
you
do,
agree with that?
I agree with you, but what lawyers can do worldwide is we can also start using the court systems to put pressure. Because right now, up till now, we have tried to use international law, the negotiation process. We have tried to help with drafting ideas and creating other kinds of legal systems. But maybe we as a group should also try to use the legal systems, whether in the developing world, whether in the developed world, or in international courts, maybe with human rights violation issues, or arguing that one state is violating the right to exist of another state. So maybe we as lawyers need to begin to use the judiciary as a tool to test how far we should go. Now, this may not work in civil law countries, but maybe in common law countries there is a possibility to push this idea further, because in common law countries the judiciary often has more powers. And I think we have to use the legal system from local to global level in order to create a force to actually make sure that there is some rule of law, some justice coming out, because we have to compete with the neoliberal capitalist domination of ideas in the system, which, for example, ensures that industry has much more freedom than other systems. And maybe our job is to get this other movement going, a movement for global constitutionalism and rule of law.
But if one takes it from the completely the other angle, be this hardcore realist or
Yeah.
devil's advocate or whatever, and there is a state which is not at that height anymore, but at this.
Yes.
Water is over. There are many landlocked countries. They could say, well, this little island was very fortunate. They had this big zone of 200 nautical miles
Yes.
around, a lot of rich resources in, possibly even oil or gas, or who knows what. Now they have lost this territory, and territory was the basis
Yes.
for governance of the water, because what we do, really, we are terrestrial species, and we look from the coast to the water as the water here, the sea,
Yes.
is just for us. We lay our rights on the sea, we use it and so on. Now, well, there is no territory, no inhabitable territory. And then a landlocked state could say, well, look, I would like a portion of that.
Yes. I'll put a flag over there.
Yes, I would like, I mean,
Yes.
now it's a high seas.
Yes.
Meaning I wouldn't appropriate it, but I would like to use it along with everybody else. There is some very good fishing over
Yes.
there, and I would like to send my ships over there.
Yes.
Do we have really, in current international law, do we have any rules to deal with this situation today? I mean, in terms of zones, this probably would be lost, but I was thinking, well, we have treaty law, and treaty law doesn't solve the issue. We have customary law. But then when we go further the line, we have those general principles of law. Do you think, when I'm listening what you're saying, you probably would think that there would be some general rules, really?
Well, the thing is that
Moral.
up till now, all property ownership, whether it's at
Yes.
at an individual level or at the level of the state, has almost always been in terms of first come, first served. Whoever goes and puts his flag gets that, tries to make a claim.
Is this the law of the Anthropocene?
Well, I would argue no. I would
No.
argue that in the Anthropocene, so that was a law of the Holocene, and if we move into the Anthropocene, for me, it's really important to also look at global equity. So landlocked states have been denied access to the
Yes.
seas, and so for them, it's really important to see how they can get more access to the seas.
Well, legally they have access, but they can't.
They can't use the economic zones.
sovereignty.
Yes.
They can't get.
They can't use the exclusive economic
No,
zones,
no.
so they don't have
That's
that.
for the others.
That's for the others.
That's for the others.
So I think the Anthropocene will not only, there will be two elements of the Anthropocene. The first element of the Anthropocene is because we overuse our resources, we are going to realize that we have limited resources, limited environmental utilization space for us all, whether it is ocean or it is fresh water or it is land or it's minerals.
Yes.
So if
Yeah.
it is limited, then the question is how do we share? And that sharing issue becomes absolutely essential in the Anthropocene. So the law of the Anthropocene for us lawyers has to be how do we share? And there are four ways to share in governance theory. The first way to share is to use the markets, and that's the neoliberal capitalist model, which is you price whatever is scarce and then you let the markets trade it. But this will empower the rich, because only the rich can buy all these resources up, or they can put their flag at distant, distant places and say, I claim this for myself. The second alternative is hegemony, and that goes into the story of the state. The state says, this is mine, I'm not going to share it with anybody else. And so, for example, some countries may say, we will not export certain resource. Another country will say, I won't share my water. So Egypt is unwilling to share its water of the Nile based on legal principles of the Holocene with Ethiopia. So you'll get all these sovereignty and securitization arguments used by states to protect whatever resources they have and to gain access to others. The third alternative is sort of a free-for-all, polycentric governance where everybody does their own thing. But if we go from the starting point, the resources are limited, polycentric governance alone will not solve it. So ultimately what we need is some kind of global framework of governance within which we allow markets to function, within which we allow sovereignty rules and securitization, and within which we allow polycentric governance. But we do need a framework of governance. And here I'd like to make a point, because every time I look at what the private sector argues, they often say we don't want rules, we want deregulation. But the private sector makes all its money based on contracts, and contract law is what you and I have been working on too as lawyers. So lawyers have created the whole basis of contracts. We have helped to ensure that these contracts cannot be ignored, and that companies can invest money and can get returns on their money, and it can't be
Shame on
negated.
us.
Yeah, but so private international law, private national law is really strong. And then why is it that then they benefit from one type of law but are unwilling to invest in the other type of law, which is public international law or the law of global public goods? And that's really what's important for us to try and get in the era of the Anthropocene.
About sharing, this really is very important. But look how it looks, how the sharing looks in the today's law of the sea. And what do we share? In which way? Now here is the coast. We share it like this. We share the sea in many zones. From the coast there is a small stretch of internal waters. Then there is territorial sea. Here we have sovereignty. Those who are on the coast.
Yeah.
Then there is some contiguous zone. There is exclusive economic zone. We share it, but only for navigation. But we don't share fishing resources here because they are plentiful here. That we don't share. We have sovereign rights. Under it, we share many things. You can lay your pipelines, you can make scientific research, you could do this and that, but you can't take oil. This we don't share. We don't share this even further. To the edge of the continental margin, only coastal states can take oil, gas, that's reserved. However, above, on the high seas, which is beyond 200 nautical miles, we share fishing. You know, but there is almost no fish there. It's not much fish.
Yeah.
It's much more closer to the.
Yeah.
And then what we share beyond those continental shelves, that is at the maximum 350 nautical miles, we share. International community has the right.
Yeah.
This is called area, international area, and it's proclaimed as a common heritage of mankind. There is basically not much oil really there, almost none. There are some manganese nodules.
Yeah.
There are some nodules, of course, but
it's less economically viable. Yeah.
at the moment it's a kind of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
It might come in future.
Yeah.
What we share is we share it horizontally
Yeah.
according to our interests.
Exactly.
But what we are here actually discussing here is a vertical sharing. Certain uses of the sea. When we leave this Holocene, and when we are now entering the Anthropocene, maybe we have entered, we will have probably to think about vertical sharing.
That's
we will have to share jointly through the zones.
Yes, that's a very interesting concept. Let me now take you into freshwater law. In freshwater law, we have sharing principles. So we say if you have a river between two countries, then there are 6 or 7 equity principles that you have to use to decide who gets what share of the water. Traditionally, of course, countries that used more of the water claimed historical rights to the water, and therefore they were unwilling to share the water. But the International Watercourses Convention tries to come up with these shares. But it's interesting because like you spoke of countries that are landlocked, those areas that are near the river but are not linked to the river are not part of the river basin. So if they are a separate country, they have no right at all to the waters of the river basin. But even if they are within the country, very often the idea of river basin management ignores their rights to that water of the river. And so that, when you talk about your horizontal and vertical, we do find some sort of horizontal rules about water sharing, but in the future we'll have to go to what you call vertical sharing of the water, because that means that you also have to share with dry areas even if they're not on the river basin. You have to share with dry countries even if they don't share.
But what do you think, how much we need to wait for this future? Because I was looking at simply at some figures which are a sort of, I would say, indication of the pace of change, because we do live in the time of change. And I looked back when my father was born, mid-20s, there were 2 billion people on the earth. I mean, it took the entire history of our species to the beginning of 19th century to get to the 1 billion. And then 125 years approximately to the second. When I was born, well, it was one generation after. I was born in 1960. And exactly at that year, there were 3 billion. Now, when my son was born, we were over 6 billion. And today we are over 7. So in my lifetime, and I consider myself young, it's, well, more. I was at the 3 billion, and now it's more than that. It's much more. It's 4 billion in a single lifetime. This pace is an illustration It is not. I'm not talking here about too many people on the earth. I'm talking about the quick chain, interlinked causes and effects. Here, technology develops quickly and so on. Everything is quick. I mean, my mobile phone, I have it here somewhere. I mean, people, my children tell me that I'm from the other planet when I show it, because I haven't changed it for 5 years. So when is this future coming? Because everything is quicker and quicker. How will we react? What is the...
I think you said earlier that the concept of the Anthropocene was probably mentioned once in 2000,
Yes.
maybe once in 2002, and then now it has
And then
gone up to
a million, yes.
million. So
Yeah.
it takes a bit of time before a concept really starts to roll. And what we do find is that there is a lot of discussion about Earth system governance in the Anthropocene. How do we get that community of people to start thinking about adapting to change, not adapting actually, but proactively reacting? Up till now, there's a whole lot of discussion about adaptive capacity, about resilience, but all that is a little bit too reactive for me. What we need in the Anthropocene is much more proactive thinking. But a proactive thinking will always mean that even though there are some people who put ideas on the table, before you can take society with you, it will take time. On the other hand, you never know. It can go very fast. And sometimes we have to sort of try and gather momentum, and for that you need a social movement. And this brings me back to my argument that if we see that law has a very specific, and international and national, has a very specific role to play in governance, that a law provides the basics of society. It is within the framework of law that we all function, that we cross roads, that we stop at red lights, that we walk on cycle paths, or that we cycle on cycle paths, walk on pedestrian paths. If law generates all the rules of society, if that is the case, then it is really important for us to train the next batch of lawyers and law school students to actually focus on getting a mass movement, a social movement, to try and see whether we can get a quantum jump in legal knowledge, legal studies. How you do it, I don't know. But
Do you think beyond the sphere of law, is there a role which the Anthropocene Working Group has played a useful role? Because when I look, really, 2009, this is when the Anthropocene Working Group was established, really in the summer of 2009, when those 74 famous hits were done on Google, and now it's a million. I think that what they did really is like making a snowball on the hill and rolling it through the scientific mountain, because more and more scientists consider this concept of having a very significant, very important relevance, this hypothesis so far.
there are two ways to answer your question. The first question is, yes, if they have started in 2009 and they're really discussing it, that it is possible that they will create the conditions under which it is possible to change law. On the other hand, I hear that the Anthropocene Commission has not yet decided when the Anthropocene started. So there's all this debate about whether it's 1945, whether it's 1990, whether it is maybe
Industrial
1750,
Revolution,
or whether
yes.
it is the start of settled agriculture. And if it is the start of settled agriculture, then all the law that we've had has been the law of the Anthropocene and not of the Holocene. So it's a little bit complicated. For me, I think the Anthropocene concept must be used pragmatically. I understand that the Commission will also decide when Anthropocene begins.
They are very pragmatic as well, probably.
So for us, we should look at it as a way to explain to the public that things are changing so fast. We can't do business as usual in the legal field. We can't do business as usual in the governance field. And maybe we have to start thinking about, is a 4-year or a 5-year democratic political process in sync with the kind of changes that we are making on Earth? Maybe we have to drastically revisit how we organize society. And in that sense, a constitution or a rule of law system has a longer life. Because even if we stick to our 5-year politicians and we stick to our national boundaries, maybe a constitution for the next 100 years could enable us to speed up this process of moving governance.
Speeding up, that's a very important thing here. And already in 2016, that's very soon, the Anthropocene Working Group will present its evidence, its conclusions, for ratification. There are several bodies that need to ratify. But already when those conclusions are on the table, they will be based on findings from strata, from rocks. Wouldn't we as lawyers say, well, this is a rock hard proof? This is now a very important, very significant indicator that there is a deep need for awareness raising among
But would
in the global
politicians
community.
think that? And that's the question of politics. It's possible that the academic community would agree with you and say we have rock hard proof now that we're moving into a different era. But for those who have vested interest, for those who make money from oil or from deforestation or from various exploitations of the Earth's ecosystem, even if it is rock hard proof, maybe they're not interested in changing their lives. And maybe they have so much power within the democratic systems in which some of our countries function that they are able to actually hold the government captive to the current system. So the question is, how do
So
we...
this is ostrich
Yes,
putting
it's the
the
ostrich
hand
way.
in the sand.
Absolutely. So the
Yes.
question is, how do we mobilize another group of people who are probably larger in numbers than the vested interests to understand that this is a real deep change, and that if we want to keep the Earth for our children and grandchildren, it's really important to change. Because if you look at the whole problem in terms of geological timescales, the humans are insignificant.
Yes.
So then lawyers are not really looking at the future in geological timescales. We are really looking at the future in terms of our children and our grandchildren.
And humans are significant for humans themselves.
And
isn't it?
humans are significant for humans. It's not for the Earth.
Yes, yes, I agree with that. We are a very special species, it seems. But
So one of the things that struck me also from all our discussions in the last few days about what is the Anthropocene, and I'm not a geologist, so it was very interesting to see that all the epochs or time periods that we have assigned to the past can be seen on our rocks. So different fossils and different layers can reflect something that happened in the past. And then if I go to law and I look at 5,000 years of water law, I see that early civilizations made certain rules and customs. And then you have the legal rules that were made by religion. Most of the time, the religion institutionalized those customary rules. And then you had conquests and colonization, and then the rulers brought their own rules with them. And very often, the rulers did not change the rules in life, but changed the rules in the books, because they wanted to show I am the ruler. But they did not want to irritate the local population. So you get all these different layers coming through. And then in the 20th century, you get the International Law Association influencing what kind of rules should come. After that, you get all the natural scientists, the hydrologists, etc., coming with their ideas about how to govern water. So in most developed countries, you do have a sort of a system of water law which is fairly synchronized, but in most developing countries you have different strata of water law superimposed on top of each other. So it's possible that the law in a particular developing country in the books is totally different from the law that's being actually lived by the local people in particular areas. So you're getting multiple stratas of law in the same way as you are getting fossil proof of past legal existence in the Anthropocene. So that's also an interesting parallel to the way.
stratigraphy of international law here.
That's right.
You see, but also we said, well, but what is our look at the Earth? I was struck by one sentence which I saw as a motto in a museum in Vienna, which I visited a month ago. I think I have it here in a notebook, and it says, it's a museum of globes in Vienna. And look at our approach really to the Earth. It says, globes are constantly changing mirror images of world history. And globes show political boundaries. But if the
And that changes,
Earth, if the Earth is now moving from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, does this mean that the world will stay still in the Holocene with its own old boundaries, with its concepts? That's still a question for me.
Are you saying that are we going to challenge national boundaries and the concept of statehood?
If the boundaries will start to be changed, not by politics, but by nature, by the case of sea level rise, this means we will not challenge them. They will start to be challenged by themselves.
Yes.
And then there is a big dilemma. how to reconcile our legal framework with natural reality.
Yes, but here I see a very interesting north-south dimension coming up. If you take the Netherlands, you can see that the Netherlands is going to protect its boundaries at all costs.
Yes.
We have
And do
everything
you
in
know
place.
that they will be the least affected?
Probably they will.
They will be the no,
they will be the least. Yes,
because
the
of
sea level
of the
rise will
yes,
go up less
less
in
over there,
Netherlands,
yes.
but they have protected all their boundaries in such a way
With
that
the
it will not be
dams.
touched.
Yes.
But you're talking about Tuvalu, Maldives, all these
No
countries
facilities.
can't exactly. But even bigger countries, Bangladesh or India or the whole African coastline, they will be affected by their boundaries changing as a result of sea level rise. But even the mountain regions will have different changes because the glaciers will start to melt. So what you will find is that maybe the changes on climate change will start to affect the boundaries of developing countries
Yes.
and not so much of developed countries.
That can happen.
And maybe developed countries
Yes.
are able to protect even their offshore islands
Quite
because they're so
possible.
rich.
Quite possible.
And the developing countries can't. And this actually gives a completely a different dimension to the North-South crisis as a result of the Anthropocene. So I think southern governments really have to wake up and start thinking about whether they want to push for a long-term legal solution to these kinds of issues. So maybe not just the lawyers should be part of the social movement. We have to get the developing country governments to start thinking about what the changes in the Anthropocene mean for them and their future, and therefore whether we need a new governance model for the Earth as a whole.
You know, Joyeeta, if we were now in Google, we would certainly make at least 2 hits, you and I. And now we have to hope that in 5 years' time,
Yeah.
there will be 1 million hits.
Oh, yeah, we have
With
to hope
this type of
for law in the Anthropocene, not just Anthropocene.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank
It was
you
a
very
great
much.
conversation.
Thank you.